Playing Nirvana.
The Cobain 50.
Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums.
Nirvana.
From listener-powered KEXP.
This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. This week, Martin dives into the album Meet the Beatles by The Beatles, which dropped in 1964.
I don't know if you've heard of these guys.
They're kind of in the underground, Liverpool underground sort of scene, right?
Yeah. No, they're pretty dope. I mean, they got some bangers.
Interesting. Okay, I'm excited to check it out. Add it to my queue. Martin, what can you tell us about what we're about to get into today?
Well, all jokes aside, because of how good they are one of the most over-evaluated bands of all time. So I wanted to hone in on the early years because Meet the Beatles is their second American release. So I thought it would be cool to go back into the roots of the Beatles, talk about them playing in Liverpool and Hamburg, and also their finding inspiration from Black music. And that's kind of how they pivoted into the band that they became and use that as a jump off point to go into some pretty far reaching territory, as, you know, we all probably know at this point.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get into the origins behind the Beatles. This is going to be a really great episode. Here's Martin Douglas with Meet the Beatles by the Beatles.
It won't be long, yeah.
It can't be overstated that the Beatles are widely regarded as the most significant musical act of the 20th century, and to some, by a wide margin. Some say they led the charge of turning rock music into fine art. Others claim they made the LP format the definitive statement for recording artists, taking that distinction away from singles. And of course, you can't walk into a concert hall, record store, or music history museum without tripping over someone who thinks the Beatles are the greatest group of all time. They were a formative influence on the namesake of this very podcast, Kurt Cobain.
But at a really early age, I wanted to be a rock and roll star. I wanted to play drums. You know, ever since I got my first Beatles record, I wanted to play drums in a band. I wanted to have the adoration of John Lennon, but have the anonymity of Ringo Starr, you know? I didn't want to be the front man. I just wanted to be back there, but, you know, be a rock and roll star at the same time.
As much as the Beatles have influenced scores of musicians up to this very day, the band themselves had influences. That's how the nature of inspiration works, right? Artists take the art they're moved by. The greatest ones do their best to shape it into their own image, and then they pass it on to artists inspired by them. They add another link to the chain.
We're gonna write a little letter, gonna mail it to my local DJ. It's a rocking little record, I want my jockey to play.
The Beatles came from a music scene indebted to rhythm and blues and its wide-eyed successor, rock and roll. At the time of the band's formation, these were predominantly Black genres of music, and the so-called Fab Four always held deep respect for the pioneers of the rock and roll sound. In fact, it's difficult to imagine what the Beatles would have sounded like in their early years without their knowledge of and love for Black music.
I roll over Beethoven, tell Tchaikovsky the news.
Liverpool is a port town in England. That's important to note in terms of its rock and roll scene, because that style of music first made its way to the city through records from the United States. The earliest American import records to come into Liverpool were blues, soul, and early rock and roll records brought in, more or less individually, by music-obsessed members of the United Kingdom Merchant Navy. Sailors brought over other quintessentially American cultural items too, like Wrangler jeans. But the stuff that really changed Liverpool's music scene were 45s by artists like Fats Domino,
Blue Monday, how I hate Blue Monday.
And Sam Cooke.
Darling, you send me, I know you send me.
In the 1950s, Liverpool was still reeling from World War II, It was largely described as a city in decay. Factories were closing, and tens of thousands of people were on the dole. That's British slang for unemployment benefits. The buildings were blackened by smoke coming from ships entering the harbor. On one hand, Liverpool was a dark and depressed place. On the other hand, the cheap living gave lots of budding musicians plenty of time to practice.
I've gambled down in Washington, and I've gambled up in Maine. I'm going down into Georgia to knock down my last game.
Before rock and roll washed up on the docks of Liverpool, skiffle was the sound of the city. Skiffle was a music stew of sorts, stemming from popular pre-war styles of American music. It combined folk, blues, country, bluegrass, and even some strains of jazz.
I'm a gambling man, I'm a gambling man, a gambling man, I'm a gambling man.
This brings us to the famous long-haired Beatle. John Lennon grew up with his Aunt Mimi, but when he visited his mother, she played him Elvis Presley records and taught him banjo. Lennon eventually learned how to play guitar too, of course. Here's Lennon talking about being inspired by Elvis. This audio was taken from archival footage posted on YouTube by Music Box USA.
When I was 16, Elvis is what was happening. A guy with long, greasy hair, wiggling his ass and singing Hound Dog and That's All Right Mama on those early Sun records, which I think are his great period.
The first song his mother taught him on guitar was Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame.
Ain't that a shame? My tears feel like rain. Ain't that a shame? You're the one to blame.
In 1956, a teenage Lennon formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen were named in tribute to the school Lennon went to, the Quarry Bank High School. After playing school dances, house parties, and Battle of the Band style competitions, Paul McCartney joined the band in 1957. Here's McCartney talking about seeing Lennon perform for the first time.
There was a few lads around, and there was one particular guy I noticed at the front, had a sort of checked shirt, sort of blondish kind of hair, a little bit curly, sideboards, looking pretty cool. And he was playing sort of one of these guitars guaranteed not to crack, not a very good one. But he was making a very good job of it, and I remember being quite impressed. And he was doing a song by the Del Vikings called Come Go With Me. And the thing about it was, he obviously didn't know the words, but he was pulling in lyrics from blues songs. So instead of going, come little darling, come and go with me, which is right, he'd then go, down, down, down to the penitentiary. And he'd be doing sort of stuff he'd heard on Big Bill Brunsey records and stuff. So I thought, that's clever. He's pretty good. That was John.
In the winter of 1958, McCartney recommended a neighborhood pal of his who played guitar named George Harrison.
George and I lived very near each other in Liverpool. So, in fact, we were just a bus stop away from each other. I'd get on the bus, and then the stop afterwards, George would get on. So being quite close in age, we'd sit together and we'd talk about stuff and that.
With the addition of McCartney and then Harrison, the Quarrymen gradually moved towards a rock and roll style. The other members who were still into skiffle departed the band. Meanwhile, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and bassist Stuart Sutcliffe cycled through several different names. After a couple different variations on the moniker, they landed on the Beatles, inspired by a collective favorite band of theirs, Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
Oh, the little things you say and do make me want to be with you.
Before officially becoming the Beatles, the band played around Liverpool as a drumless quartet, perhaps most notably at the Casbah Coffee Club. The Casbah was located in the cellar of a home owned by a woman named Mona Best. After the name change, they played around town until they were offered a 15-week residency in Hamburg, Germany, on the condition that they play with a drummer. The day before the band left for Hamburg, they auditioned and hired Mona Best's son, Pete. Here's Lennon on the experience of playing grueling shows in Hamburg for hours on end.
In Hamburg, because we had to work 6 or 7 hours a night on stage with no rest, the waiters always had these pills called Preludin. And so the waiters, when they'd see the musicians falling over with tiredness or with drink, they'd give you the pill. You'd take the pill, you'd be talking, you'd sober up. You know, you could work almost endlessly until the pill wore off, then you'd have to have another.
That 15-week residency turned into 21 months over 2 stints. Between August 1960 and May 1962, the Beatles honed their chops by playing more than 250 gigs in Hamburg. Performances usually lasted 6, 7, 8, sometimes even 12 hours. Of course, no up-and-coming band has that many original songs, so the Beatles played covers by many of their heroes, which included a long list of Black American artists, like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles ballad, You Really Got a Hold on Me.
Oh, you treat me badly. I love you madly. You've really got a hold on me.
And the Isley Brothers' hit version of Twist and Shout.
Well, shake it up, baby, now. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout.
While the Beatles were in Hamburg, a scene started growing in Liverpool.
Liverpool, the Mersey sound. A sound that means something different from what it did when Liverpool was just an important port.
Named after the River Mersey, which runs along the western border of town, Mersey Beat reformed the American export that was rock and roll music in the image of young Liverpudlians. The young men who formed the Beatles weren't the only people galvanized by imported records from the United States. In 1961, before the scene was given its name, there was a paper covering Liverpool music called Mersey Beat. In 1962, a band called the Pacifics changed their name to the Mersey Beats.
We are in love with you, my heart and I, and we are always true, my heart and I.
It might be cynical to say the name change was to capitalize on this new musical movement, but that doesn't mean it wasn't very likely. One venue, the Cavern Club, was once the epicenter of the Mersey Beat scene. Before that, though, it was a jazz club that didn't allow rock and roll. Of course, that was until rock and roll started drawing big crowds in Liverpool. The Guardian once reported that over 350 bands lived and played music in the Merseyside area. Among them were Liverpool's first all-woman band, the Liverbirds.
I've wanted to tell you for some time the things that are always on my mind.
And Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, featuring a noteworthy young drummer named Ringo Starr.
Beautiful dreamer, wake up to me. Well, you know, pretty baby, I'm on my bended knee.
At the time Mersey Beat was blowing up, Brian Epstein was running Liverpool's North End music store, NIMS for short. He heard about the Beatles when they made the cover of Mersey Beat's second issue. He watched them play numerous times at the Cavern Club and, long story short, signed them to a 5-year contract on January 24th, 1962. On their road to generational fame, the Beatles encountered a few setbacks. It took Epstein a long time to shop the band around to record labels. Decca Records famously told him, and I quote, "Guitar music is on the way out." It was one of the biggest industry fumbles of a lifetime, the music equivalent of when Babe Ruth was traded to the New York Yankees. About 3 months later, in April 1962, the Beatles signed with Parlophone Records, and Decca found themselves on the wrong side of history. In August of the same year, Ringo Starr replaced Pete Best on drums, and the Beatles as we know them were fully formed. In February 1963, the band recorded their debut LP, Please Please Me, in a single day.
Last night I said these words to my girl.
Upon its release, the album reached number 1 on the UK charts, along with the 10 Beatles full-lengths after it. In the United States, their ascent wasn't quite so easy. This next part gets a bit in the weeds, so try to stay with me here. Parlophone's parent company EMI had an American subsidiary called Capitol Records, which initially passed on the Beatles. That made way for a black-owned, mostly blues-oriented label out of Chicago called VJ Records. VJ released the Beatles' US debut, aptly titled Introducing the Beatles. It was released on January 10th, 1964, and reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. A mere 10 days later, Capitol released Meet the Beatles, comprised mostly of songs from the band's second UK album, With the Beatles. There were 2 noticeable differences between the 2 albums, though. One, Meet the Beatles only had original songs by the band, and With the Beatles featured a few famous covers, a couple of which we went over earlier. 2, Meet the Beatles led off with one of the band's most beloved songs, I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand when I say that something. I want to hold your hand.
Meet the Beatles only took 3 weeks to reach number 1. Beatlemania was in full swing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles, bring them on.
I'm sure you are somewhat familiar with how the story goes from here.
Give me money, that's what I want. That's what I want. That's what I want.
Soon enough, the Mersey beat scene died down and the Beatles continued ascending. And the vaunted Fab Four were part of a movement that saw rock and roll music move away from its rhythm and blues origins, what I'm trying to say is black origins, for a commercial product aimed squarely at white teen culture. The so-called British invasion was simply bands from England taking American music and selling it back to American audiences. But also,
yes, we're coming and loaded.
There was the Beatles' early influence, Elvis, who took Memphis and Mississippi blues into spaces where black musicians weren't allowed. He was still at the height of his influence, until he wasn't. And here in the Northwest, bands like the Wailers were taking an innovative, regional flavor of rhythm and blues to places it had never been before. And a band influenced by the Wailers, a Portland group called the Kingsmen, took an old rockin' R&B standard and turned it into a smash, Louie Louie. That led in a bunch of different directions, rather notably inspiring one of Northwest rock's most profound influences, Tacoma garage punks, the Sonics. So, with these various reinterpretations, the idea of rock and roll music being a black art form was just a memory. It feels important to emphasize that Beatlemania had a hand in this. But let's be fair here. The Beatles always called back to the fact that their chief influences were mostly black artists. In interviews, Lennon and McCartney always pay respect to their respective rock and roll idols, Chuck Berry and Little Richard. Here's Paul McCartney talking to famed producer Rick Rubin about his inspiration from American music, particularly Little Richard.
We loved American music. It was the blues tradition, the rock and roll tradition, Elvis. Everything we listened to was American. Little Richard at the piano, banging away.
And the Beatles had a deep respect for African American culture in general. In 1964, they refused to play to a segregated audience in Jacksonville, Florida, and the crowd was integrated before they got on stage. The band loved the iconic Memphis soul label Stax Records and briefly entertained the idea of recording at Stax Studios in 1966. In the 70s, John Lennon wrote a spirited rebuttal to a New York Times article claiming they had ripped off black music to become rich, saying he always paid homage to the black pioneers of rock and roll at every step of his career. He even claimed that the only white artist he listened to was Elvis Presley. His early stuff, of course. And as the Beatles became the most influential band of many people's lifetimes, black artists paid their respects right back to the band. There are a ton of great soul and R&B versions of Beatles songs out there, including ones by artists they've covered themselves, like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles' take on And I Love Her.
I give her all my love. That's all I do.
McCartney's formative influence, Little Richard, recorded a version of their Meet the Beatles hit, I Saw Her Standing There. The Beatles' influence still holds weight to this day. Beyoncé recorded a cover of the McCartney-written civil rights ballad Blackbird on her 2024 smash hit Cowboy Carter.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these sunken eyes and learn to see all your life.
The cycle of influence always comes back around. In a necessary correction of public record, documentaries and biographies on artists like Little Richard and Chuck Berry made it a point to note their hand in sculpting the sound of the Beatles. Those artists acknowledged how reverent the band was toward them. Rock and roll music is by and large regarded as one of the many contributions Black American culture gave to the world, and the Beatles are in no way diminished by that fact. Because like true artists, they took the art form and put their own unique spin on it. Their take on rock and roll just happened to be, admittedly, damn near immortal.
All my loving I will sing to you. All my loving, darling, I'll be true.
That was Martin Douglas digging into Meet the Beatles by the Beatles. Martin, were you familiar with this band much before working on this episode? We're going to keep making the same joke, people. Sorry.
So, long story short, of course,
yeah.
But I was thinking about a specific time in my life where I was like just out of high school. I had a friend named Rob who was obsessed with the Beatles, and he put their entire discography on a flash drive. It's like the very first model of a flash drive, and he like put the whole discography on it for me. It was like 3 gigabytes, which is unheard of.
Yeah.
Unheard of at the time, but also like there are videos that take up that much space nowadays.
Yeah, this isn't going to fit on my Nano.
But yeah, like I really explored and got into like the deep album cuts rather than, you know, Yellow Submarine or Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, you know, the songs that everybody has heard a million times, whether you actively listen to the Beatles or not. So yeah, that was an interesting time in my life of music discovery when I got that flash drive full of the Beatles' complete discography.
Yeah. I feel like there's like that point for most, I don't know, like music fans or people like us who get really into music where you have that phase, usually when you're a teenager, where you go through like the classic rock era.
Oh, yeah.
and like it's so foundational. It's like doing your prereqs, you know, like you got to get through it. Not that you get like it's fun, like it's cool to go through it, but yeah, the Beatles are definitely like a key point in that time frame.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what can you say what can you say about this band aside from the fact that like the Beatles are required listening if you are into guitar music whatsoever.
Yeah. And I think too, like, because the Beatles have a pretty big catalog, especially for how short of a time frame it was all done in, it's interesting that Kurt would gravitate towards this one because there's so much, like when you listen to the later albums like Revolver or something that feels more akin to Nirvana to me spiritually. But, you know, talk about like all bangers, like this album, like the first half especially is just like a greatest hits compilation.
Yeah. I mean, when you kick an album off with I Want to Hold Your Hand, like it just goes on from there. Like I've listened to this album a few dozen times and never got old. Songs stuck in my head, still listening to them.
And it's like, even if you haven't heard this album, you have heard this album.
Oh yeah.
Like the songs are just so ubiquitous. Even today, like new generations, it's like implanted in like the Matrix style. When you're born, that you hear these songs, and it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, and we've covered a lot of songs that are like that, whether it's Anarchy in the UK or My Sharona, where you've heard the song, even if you aren't a fan of that group or that style of music. It's just absolutely unavoidable.
Yeah. So why do you think Kurt picked this album on the list and not something like the White Album or some of the weirder stuff that came later?
I think that's an interesting question. I'm at a loss for words because, like you mentioned, a lot of the later works, I particularly think of I Want You, She's So Heavy, which is a perfect antecedent to Nirvana and the whole style of punk and metal and grunge and like all distilled into the intro of a Beatles song. But if I had to guess, I would say that this album is so melodically rich and most of Nirvana's best known songs have that sort of earworm quality where it's hard to not remember the melody of the song.
Totally. I remember like in one of the many Nevermind documentaries, they talk about Kurt wanting to write the songs like lullabies, like that level of simplicity. And I feel like that's maybe a parallel with Nirvana and the Beatles. Like when you strip it down, the songs are very basic, but they're so tight. Like they're so catchy and undeniable.
Absolutely. So here's an interesting question. What do the Beatles mean to music in 2024?
Man, we're going for big existential questions here.
I'll go ahead and say that I don't know if they really have a direct legacy. Like I feel as though they're kind of a few degrees of separation from the artists that are deemed influential now. Like I don't see a lot of artists that are like, oh yeah, we're really into the Beatles. You know, if you go back a generation to stuff we were weaned on, like, you know, Elliott Smith comes to the top of my head.
Yes.
Nirvana, obviously. That was a sort of frame of reference where it's like, oh yeah, this person's super into the Beatles. But now it's just like a generation apart from what artists are doing nowadays. Like I feel like the closest frame of reference is the song Black Beatles. Or like when that year at the Grammys when that tweet, "Who is Paul McCartney?" went viral.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's getting to the point where, like, if you think about the time the Beatles were in, where there were songs like, I don't know, Moon River or something that were like standards.
Yeah.
The Beatles are just kind of standards at this point. Maybe you'll hear someone do Yesterday, and it's just like, that's just a part of the canon of music, you know?
Yeah.
That it's just, which is, I mean, that's like an incredible place to get as an artist. Like, your music just, like we're saying, just exists.
Right.
In our popular culture. When we were talking to Michael Azerrad, he talked about how, like, kids love the Beatles. And, you know, I've been playing Beatles for my daughter. We watched when she was little. I put on the Let It Be documentary, and she was like sleeping on me and stuff. But like, she immediately responds to the music and like just like really loves it. And I didn't want to be a Beatles dad. Like that was an outright goal. Like, I don't want to be the stereotypical Beatles dad. But then they do kind of love it, and then you kind of reassess it yourself, and you're like, oh yeah, like I kind of take one of those bands you take for granted, like we've talked about a few times on the series. We're like, oh yeah, like I think it was uncool for a while to like the Beatles. Like there was a lot of critical reevaluation, and you know, some of the stuff you speak to, like when they were, you know, like gleaning from like these black artists and rock and roll from America, and great conversation to be had there, which we get into too. But the songs do hold up, and the albums do hold up, and it is kind of a miraculous run that they had.
And yeah, if we want to get into the foundations of the Beatles, like taking cues from black artists, I think it's important to note, as I do in this episode, that unlike quite a few of their contemporaries, like Elvis, like the Rolling Stones, they took the influence of black music and put their own spin on it rather than delivering it wholesale.
Yeah.
I think it's also very interesting that they directly covered black artists. And if you hop across the pond, as they say, and listen to With the Beatles instead of Meet the Beatles, there are quite a few covers of American artists. I think there are half a dozen.
Yeah.
Like Please Mr. Postman, Roll Over Beethoven, Smokey Robinson's You Really Got a Hold on Me. Like those are, you know, classic songs in the American music canon.
Yeah.
That not only did the Beatles derive influence from, but they covered directly.
They certainly like had a lot of reverence for these artists too. Like they talk about, like in that recent Let It Be or Get Back is the name of the documentary.
Yeah.
That documentary, they talk a lot about their like worship of Chuck Berry, and so much reverence, which I feel it comes through in the covers and then putting their own spin on it. But yeah, I mean, you've talked about this too, but also like, you know, I was in London a few years ago and I went to a pub, and the whole time they were just playing Little Richard, Chuck Berry, like all these like classic American music, which feels like more excitement about it still over across the pond than here at that times.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you listen to a song like I Saw Her Standing There, it's not a Chuck Berry song, but it's a Chuck Berry song.
Yeah.
I went to London for the first time in 2021, and one of my favorite places that I went there was a store, a record shop called Honest John's, and it was right on Ladbroke Grove on the way to the Portobello Market, and it was all black music. It's funny because the guy was from Vancouver originally and moved to London I think 30 or 40 years prior, but he's in London. He's got this store. It's all black music. There, you know, posters of Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and they're, you know, jazz records, hip hop records, R&B records. And it really opened my eyes to the reverence and respect that British music fans have for black music. Like I can, you know, I feel as though I can go to just about any record store or like thrift store with a record bin and find some crazy old import R&B record that, you know, you wouldn't be able to find if you went to, you know, just a general old American record shop that's, you know, got Taylor Swift or Charlie XCX on the end cap.
Right.
So, yeah, that's one of the things that really opened my eyes about London is that kind of reverence to history and where the genre of rock music comes from. Also, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite NTS programs, which is Diddy Wah, which plays a lot of garage rock, but also a ton of old school R&B and early rock and roll, which is, kind of my wheelhouse right now. Like, I feel like you mentioned being a Beatles dad. Like I'm becoming a blues dad, even though I'm just a dog stepdad. Like I'm getting into like blues and early rhythm and blues, like, well, peak rhythm and blues, in my opinion, before it turned into this nebulous genre called R&B, which is basically just pop music, which nothing wrong with that.
Right.
And just early rock and roll, like that's the kind of stuff that I'm really feeling right now. So to tackle the Beatles and their early years was really cool for me because I heard a lot of the stuff that I'm super into right now in that sound.
That's awesome. And I love the approach you took with this. Like we've been saying, it's hard to talk about the Beatles because what else is there to say? But there's so much leading up to them and continuing after them too that informed their music and continues to inform music today.
Yeah. I think the thing that is exemplified the most in this podcast is that music is part of a continuum. And so if you can go from Kurt back to the Beatles, then you can go from the Beatles back to Little Richard, you know?
What more can we say?
Yeah. I think we did the Beatles enough justice today. We worked really hard to do it, to say something new and insightful about the Beatles, but I think we did it.
Kudos to you for taking on one of the maybe hardest episodes of the series. This piece was produced by Martin Douglas. Audio was mixed by Roddy Nikpour. Our podcast manager is Isabel Khalili. And Larry Mizell Jr. is our director of editorial.
We appreciate you all for listening to this podcast for all of these weeks. And if you would like to do something extra special for us, we'd love for you to donate whatever you can to KEXP, support independent music journalism. $6 a month will do it, or whatever you can spare for a one-time donation. It goes a long way to put food on our table. Dusty's a Beatles dad. On that note, I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. We'll see you next week on the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP, where the music matters. I had found out through my editors over the years that I was an emo kid. I was like, no, I don't like emo. And they're like, all these bands you're pitching are emo bands. I think it was like Gwen at the Weekly when we were both writing there.
Yeah.
She's like, yeah, you're like our resident emo reporter. I'm like, no, I'm not. Don't tell me what I am, Mom. It's not a phase.
I think at some point you age out of emo.
Yeah, ideally.